Hello and welcome to the Oregon Office of Emergency Management's Great Oregon ShakeOut webinar and Facebook Live event. My name is Althea Rizzo and I'll be your host today. I'm the Geologic Hazards Coordinator with the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, and I'm excited to tell you about this important annual ShakeOut drill and how you can prepare for earthquakes. Before we get started, to avoid any noise interference, please keep your audio muted. You can mute yourself by using the audio button at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom platform. If you're calling in by phone, please press *6 to mute your device. Also, please turn off your video so others can focus on the presentation. This event is being recorded and is streaming live on Facebook. A recording of this event will also be available on the OEM YouTube channel with instructions for accessing translations and closed captioning. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box on Zoom or in the comments on the Facebook Live video. We have moderators that will facilitate your questions at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. This presentation is available in Spanish if you are using Zoom on your computer. It is not available using the dial-in audio features. To access the Spanish interpretation, go to your Zoom controls, click on the global icon at the bottom right of your screen, and select Spanish. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's talk about earthquakes. Next slide, please. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today was why? Why do we prepare? Why do we think about natural hazards and how we can get our families and our friends and our neighbors prepared for these kinds of events? And the first reason is really to keep ourselves safe, to keep our loved ones safe, and to keep our neighbors safe. We take all of these preparations because we care about what happens in our community. And another reason why we prepare is so that our communities are able to recover more quickly. Since it takes time to get resources and supplies into disaster-struck locations, it's really important for households and individuals to be able to be self-sufficient for at least 2 weeks after a major event, so that those resources can really go towards critical needs. And so that's why we say anyone who can prepare should prepare. And that will make sure that when a bad day happens in Oregon, we're able to help our families, we're able to help our neighbors, and we are able to help our communities recover more quickly. Next slide, please. So what's the most important thing you can do to prepare? Well, the first thing you should be thinking about is making a plan. We've all heard the old saw about no plan survives contact with the enemy. And it's really the process of planning much more than having the complete plan, because it doesn't even have to be a good plan or even a complete plan. Just having that conversation and thinking about what you might need can really help you in an emergency situation so that you're not having to make up things as you go along. And then once you have a plan, you can share that plan with your social group and your networks. And this accomplishes 2 things. So for instance, if you have a meeting place for your family or for your neighborhood, and your social group and your networks know where that place is, if you don't show up to that place, they know to go looking for you to see if you need assistance. And then another thing that's really important is to know the hazards that are in your area. Not everyone in Oregon has the same hazards everywhere. Some places are going to be prone to wildland fires. Some places are going to be prone to flooding or winter storms. If you're over on the coast and we have a Cascadia earthquake, you can also have the tsunami. So it's really important to understand what the hazards are in your area. Next slide. So the biggest hazard we have here in Oregon is the Cascadia subduction zone. A subduction zone is where you have two tectonic plates colliding into each other, and one is being pushed underneath the other one. That's the subduction zone. And we have a subduction zone sitting right off of our coast, and it runs from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia. So it's a very long fault line. And so we know that subduction zones produce the largest earthquakes because they tend to be the largest fault areas. It takes a very large fault to create a very large earthquake. So whenever you see an earthquake over about an 8.5, you can almost always be assured that it is a subduction zone earthquake. And when we start to think about how big Cascadia is going to be, we can look to the 2011 Japanese event and the 2004 Sumatra event to see what we can expect here in Oregon. And then, of course, after the earthquake, we have the tsunamis that will be coming onshore fairly shortly afterwards. Next slide. So no matter what you read or read on the internet, there's no way to predict an earthquake. What we can do is look at the science and look at what has happened in the past. And geologists have found that we've had around 41 of these earthquakes in the last 10,000 years. And what this means is this has happened over and over again in the past, and it will certainly be happening again in the future. We just don't know when. There's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to planning for Cascadia, and we just kind of have to be okay with that because we don't know when it's going to happen and we don't know how big it's going to be. So we've had 41 of these earthquakes in the last 10,000 years. About half of those times, it's been the full rupture, the 9.0 earthquakes. The other half of the time, it's been smaller earthquakes, but these smaller earthquakes start at about a 7.6 magnitude. So while a smaller earthquake will have a much more narrowly focused impact to a smaller region, they're still very, very large earthquakes. So we don't know when it's going to be, and we don't know how big it's going to be, but we do know that it will be happening at some point in the future. And so if we look at time between earthquakes in the past, if we look at the entire rupture, those big earthquakes happen about every 500 years. But when we start to look at these smaller ruptures, that time between earthquakes gets smaller. So it's the last Cascadia subduction zone earthquake happened in the year 1700. So we do know that this is going to happen. We do know that it's probably going to be happen before we're fully prepared, but we really need to think about how we can get our families best prepared for Cascadia, because once you're ready for Cascadia, you are pretty much ready for anything that the Oregon weather or natural hazards can throw at you. Next slide. So when we're looking at what happens during an earthquake, of course, we have the strong ground shaking, and this is really where our building strong infrastructure and building our built environment to withstand these earthquakes is really going to help us to be able to recover quickly. We've only known about Cascadia as being a hazard since about the mid-1980s. So this is kind of a new hazard. So we have a lot of catch up to do, but our built environment is really going to affect how quickly we're able to recover. So on the bottom of this slide, we have a tale of two cities, or the tale of two countries with two different earthquakes. On the left, we have Haiti. Haiti had a 7.0 earthquake in 2010. And it devastated the country. It killed 250,000 people. Because their built environment was so vulnerable to the earthquake, and buildings just simply collapsed. Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world, and they just simply weren't able to prepare properly. On the right side of the slide, we have the 2011 Japanese event. And for the most part, outside of the tsunami zone, Japan was back up and running within a few weeks with their transportation, their infrastructure, because they've spent the last 50 years preparing for these very large earthquakes. So we know that it can be accomplished here in Oregon. Next slide. The next issue that we're going to be dealing with a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake are landslides. Oregon knows about landslides. We have a big winter storm, somebody in Portland sneezes, and suddenly we have lots of landslides around the state. And this is really going to impact our ability to get resources out to where we need them, because this is going to affect our road system. And some of our road systems, for instance, between I-5 and 101 could be impacted and impassable to just general traffic for 3 to 5 years afterwards. So landslides are going to impact us greatly. Next slide. The next hazard that we have with earthquakes is liquefaction. This is when during the shaking, when you have unconsolidated, saturated soils, it basically turns to pudding during the shaking, and it can flow downhill. It can cause sand boils to come up out of the ground, and it really affects underground utilities, and that's where most of our utilities are. After the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, there were neighborhoods that were without sewer systems for over 2 years. They were using porta potties. And there are other parts of Christchurch that they've simply returned to green space because they can't engineer a solution to deal with that liquefaction. And so this is one of the other hazards that we're going to be dealing with Cascadia. And when you think about a lot of where our beautiful downtowns are, they're built near rivers and they're built on liquefiable soils. So we have kind of the double hazard there of liquefaction and old unreinforced masonry buildings. Next slide. And then, of course, after the earthquake, we have the tsunami. And depending on where you are on the coast, it could be 15 to 20 minutes before the first waves arrive. And it's important to know that the first wave is often not the biggest wave, and that those waves can be coming in for 24 to 48 hours after the initial earthquake event. After the Japanese event, that tsunami was still pinging tide gauges all around the world over 72 hours later. And the thing to remember about a tsunami, especially on the Oregon coast, is the earthquake is your warning. There is no current warning system that can tell you faster that a tsunami is probably coming. So if you are on the coast and you feel a strong earthquake, you want to get to high ground as soon as possible. Don't wait for anyone to tell you that a tsunami is coming. If you feel an earthquake on the coast, just assume one is coming, because that will save your life. Next slide. It's important to know that Oregon gets 2 types of tsunamis. The first one is the Cascadia local tsunami caused by the nearshore fault zone. But the other type of tsunami that we get here in Oregon is a distant tsunami, and that's caused by a subduction zone earthquake far away from Oregon, somewhere around the Pacific Rim, the Ring of Fire. And those take hours to get here. And you will get plenty of warning that one is coming. Our closest source is the Alaskan Aleutian Island chain, and that takes almost 4 hours to get here. So just understanding that for a distant tsunami, really all you have to do is get away from the water and stay away until the local authorities say that it's safe to go back. And it doesn't take a big tsunami to cause a lot of damage. In 2011, We didn't get any inundation from that tsunami, but we did have some significant damage in some of our ports and harbors. So even a tsunami that doesn't inundate the land can still be very dangerous. And we just want people to stay out of the water for a while until it's been deemed safe. Next slide. So while we can't predict earthquakes, we've just installed a new seismic system that can tell you very quickly, once an earthquake starts, that a earthquake shaking will soon happen in your area. And this is called Shake Alert. And what happens is there is an earthquake somewhere. And there are two types of waves that is generated by an earthquake. One is fast, one is slow. The P wave, the primary wave, is fast. It doesn't cause a lot of damage. It just kind of moves through quickly. And that's what the sensors pick up on. And then it sends the alert out. The S waves, the secondary waves, are slower. Those are the ones that cause damage. So depending on where you are and where the earthquake is, you can have tens of seconds of warning before the shaking starts. Next slide. So what happens is the rocks are under strain and we don't know where a rupture will occur along that because, over time we have these tectonic plates moving at about the rate your fingernails grow. And that stress builds up over time and eventually the rocks break. And that's the rocks breaking along the fault line. That's what causes the earthquake. Next slide. And so how many seconds of warning you get really depends on where you are and where that earthquake is. The further away you are from the earthquake, the more time that you will have. Next slide. And so we know that we have the Cascadia as the big one, but Oregon also gets other types of earthquakes. We do have crustal faults. 1993, the Scotts Mills, the Klamath Falls earthquakes, both of those were crustal faults. And they were about a 6.0 and did cause some damage. The Klamath Falls did cause one death. But even smaller earthquakes like that can still cause a lot of damage. We also get deep earthquakes. The 2001 Nisqually earthquake, for instance, which was felt in Oregon, is another type of earthquake that we can get. So any one of these earthquakes can cause damage, but also can have a shake alert warning sent out about them. Next slide. So what do we do when the ground shakes? We want to make sure that the public is very well educated on what will happen when the ground strikes. So we've got this little animated video. So this is why we have the Great Oregon ShakeOut, is so that we can practice what happens during an earthquake. We found that in the Japanese event, communities that annually practice their tsunami drills had a much higher survival rate. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So just kind of recap, what do you do after the shaking stops? Well, if you're in a tsunami zone, you move to high ground by foot. You don't want to try to drive because the roads will probably be blocked. So we want people to move by foot. And then follow your emergency plan. This is the plan that we discussed earlier in the talk that you have set up with your household, your friends, and your family. Next slide. So what will it mean for Oregon after Cascadia happens? You know, as we've seen from the recent wildfires, it really is a new normal for the folks that are living in the impacted area. Japan had its event 10 years ago, and there are still areas, especially along the coastlines that were impacted by the tsunami, that have really not gotten back to normal. And so we just have to understand that all of that preparedness that we do ahead of time will get us back to that new normal faster. So next slide. The good thing is that Oregonians already do a lot of the things that help you to be much more resilient and able to deal with these emergencies. We are a state that goes camping. We have a lot of gardening. We, hike and we fish, and we do a lot of these activities that makes our lives better now, but also will be very useful when Cascadia happens. So if you go camping a lot, you already have a lot of the things that you're going to need after Cascadia, for instance, a tent or a camp stove or warm bedding. If you have a garden, even if it's just a tomato on the patio, that's some fresh food after Cascadia happens. And if you have a big garden, you can always share with your neighbors. Next slide. So we really encourage folks to go to the Oregon ShakeOut website. The address is here at the top, and you go to the Register Here button and sign up for it. And there's a lot of information on this page. And if you go up to other languages, this page is also available in Spanish. Next slide. So how do you shake out? First of all, you go register at shakeout.org/Oregon. And then on October 21st at 10:21 a.m., you drop, you cover, and you hold on for 1 minute. And it's as easy as that. And you've practiced what to do when an earthquake happens. And that means that you are that much more prepared for when the big one happens. But it's not just something that we want you to do. We would love it if you could reach out to your friends and your family and your neighbors, and also to encourage them to participate in the shakeout. It's really important for everyone who can to participate in this. We have over 500,000 people registered to participate. So we really want you to join us all underneath our kitchens tables or office desks at 10:21 on next Thursday. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate how to drop, cover, and hold. So you want to drop to the ground. That one video where you saw people being kind of splashed around like a toy in a bathtub, we want people to get down on the ground, because what we find is a lot of injuries happen when you're thrown to the ground. So as soon as you feel the ground shaking, you drop. You want to cover the back of your head, and you want to hold on to whatever it is that you are underneath. I have a nice sturdy oak desk here. And so even a nice sturdy oak desk is going to be tossed around a lot. So I'm going to cover the back of my head. I'm going to hold on to the table leg and kind of follow it if I need to. Next slide. And not everybody is going to be right next to their kitchen table when this happens. So we need to be a little bit more adaptive when it comes to doing what we need to do when that bad day happens. So here's some different alternatives for things that you can do. For instance, if you are using a cane, you can drop, you can cover, and you can hold on. If you are using a walker, you can lock it and then cover the back of your head and then hold onto your walker so you're not thrown out of it. If you're using a wheelchair, you can lock it and then cover the back of your neck and then hold on to your wheelchair so you're not thrown out of it. Next slide. So when we all work towards a common goal, we can accomplish it. We can't accomplish anything. And so that's why we really encourage Oregonian families, households, neighborhoods to participate in the Great Oregon ShakeOut, because the more we prepare now, the faster we will be able to recover then. And it doesn't take a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake to need to do this kind of preparedness. I mean, think back over this last year, we have had wildfires, we have had flooding, we have had ice storms. So it doesn't take a Cascadia to need to come together as a community and to help each other out. Next slide. So this webinar has been recorded and it's going to be posted to the YouTube channel. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can get into the accessibility options so that you can watch it and auto-translate it into your own language. If you need any other kind of assistance, please contact the number or email address on the screen. And I believe that we have one more slide. So this is my contact information, and I am always happy to talk for hours about Cascadia and preparedness. So if you have a question that's not answered today, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer it. And I believe we will go into the question and answer portion here. Do we have any questions from the chat?
We do, Althea. Robert wants to know, do coastal communities have a tsunami siren system to warn folks along the shoreline?
Some communities do. We do not have a whole coast siren system because we have a lot of rural areas on our coast. And sirens are only effective for a distant tsunami. You will feel the earthquake sooner than any kind of alerting system that we have, because we are so close to the subduction zone over on the coast. So some communities like Seaside has sirens, but those are effective for a distant tsunami. And for distant tsunamis, you're going to know about it from Facebook, from the news, the radio, the TV is going to be talking about it. Your Aunt Martha from Ohio is going to call you and say, are you in danger from the tsunami that's happening? So there's a lot of different ways to find out about distant tsunamis. And again, we're not dealing with the earthquake. So all you have to do is get away from the water for a while and just kind of hang out until they say that it's safe to go back down near the water. The sirens are just not effective for a local tsunami.
Sandy asks, if you're on the coast and the road is further away, is going to the top of your hotel okay?
We do not on the Oregon coast have any buildings that have been built that can withstand a tsunami. And that's why it's really important to ask the hotel when you make your reservations, are they in the tsunami inundation zone? That's not an automatic no for reserving there. But it just means that once you do get there, you need to learn what the route is to high ground. Oregon, we're pretty blessed with high ground. There is one hotel in Gold Beach that I stay at that's in the tsunami zone, but the high ground is literally three blocks that way, and it's a straight shot. So I keep all of my important stuff in my shoes by the door, including my car keys, because my go bag is in my car. So all I have to do is put on my shoes, grab my keys, and go and grab my go bag, and I'm up there. So being in a tsunami inundation zone is not an automatic bad thing. You just have to be aware of it and make your own preparations.
This is somewhat similar, but Rachel asks, if I live on the third floor of an unreinforced masonry building, will I die? What can I do to management to reinforce my building?
So unreinforced masonry buildings are a concern. I can't tell you specifically about your building. What tends to happen in unreinforced masonry buildings is you have the masonry walls that aren't connected to the floors or the ceiling. And so those can kind of tip out and the floors come down. And it's really about talking to your management about retrofitting that building. I'm not sure where you're located, but that might be something to talk to the other residents in that building to see what you can put together a presentation and talk to your landlords.
Thank you. Michael asked if you can touch on the Portland fault line.
Sure. So Portland has its very own fault. It's called the Portland Hills Fault. So if you think about Forest Park as it's going out along the Columbia River, that's the fault scarp of the Portland Hills Fault. And that can produce a high 6, low 7 earthquake. They don't happen very often, but when they do happen, Portland has built up all of this infrastructure over the fault line, and so it will be impacted. And that's why it's important to not just think about Cascadia, but also local crustal faults in your preparedness. And that just means, making sure that your home's been seismically retrofitted if it was built before the mid 1990s, looking at non-structural mitigation, like connecting bookshelves and things like that to the walls so that stuff doesn't fall down on you and injure you. But it just means that, Portland does have another high hazard fault that's literally underneath your feet.
Karen on Facebook asks, is there a risk of tsunami coming up the Columbia River as far as Sauvie Island?
So the answer is no, but we're not expecting a tsunami to be able to inundate, come onto dry land much further than a little ways west of Kelso. And it really depends on river conditions. If the river conditions are right, you might get some strong currents in the Portland area, and that would really only affect down by the water. But this is a big issue because a lot of our energy and fuel is down near the critical energy hub down by the river on the north end of Portland. And that's all liquefiable soil. And those facilities were built in the 1910s, 1920s, before we even understood earthquakes very well here in the Pacific Northwest. So it's another hazard that we do have to think about.
Gary asks, what are the plans for long-term evacuation of the population on the coast, given that the coast will be unlivable after a major quake?
Right. So there aren't any plans to remove everyone from the coast because people are going to want to continue living on the coast. So that's one of the reasons why we really encourage, especially folks that live over on the coast, to be prepared to be on your own for at least 2 weeks. And we know folks on the coast, it should be probably 6 months, if possible. So we do know that some people will leave the area and probably not come back, much like we saw after Katrina. But, as we're learning from the wildfires, it just takes time to rebuild. And so it may take time before people can come back to their properties to rebuild, because there's not going to be no power, no water, no sewer, those kinds of systems. It'll just take time to rebuild so that people can come back to the coast, because, the Oregon coast is beautiful. People want to live and work there.
Denise on Facebook asks, what radio station is best to listen to for updates after an earthquake?
So that's a really good question. And the answer is depends on where you are. Just about everywhere in Oregon has a designated emergency AM radio station. And so I would reach out to your fire department or your city hall to ask what your local station is.
Okay, this one's a little dark from Frances, but she does say, if your house collapses, what good does it do to be under a table?
Because that creates a pocket of space that can possibly protect you, even if your house does collapse. The thing is in subduction zone earthquakes, stick-built single-family homes, if they've had the walls connected to the foundation, had the roof connected to the walls, they don't tend to collapse. It's when we start to get into unreinforced masonry buildings. Those are those beautiful old brick downtown. And oftentimes they don't completely collapse. Sometimes what happens is you'll see the shedding of the bricks into the sidewalk. And that's why we recommend people not try to run out of buildings, because stuff is falling down. And so that's why dropping, covering, holding under something very, very sturdy can help save your lives, even if your home collapses down. And first responders are trained to look in these defensible spaces.
All right, we have a little bit more time. Those are all the questions in chat right now. I'm going to give one last call for questions. If you have one, please put it in chat. And here they all come. So if I'm in an unreinforced masonry building, should I go into the hallway?
So again, we don't want people trying to move during the earthquake. It's really important that you get low, get down, and find that defensible space. And this means, thinking about it and planning for it before the earthquake happens. Having that real sturdy kitchen table or your desk or whatever it is. Moving during an earthquake is very likely to get you injured. And this is what we found in Loma Prieta and in Northridge, is people who were trying to move around got injured. And we want to avoid that. And you want to avoid that because, as we've seen now with the pandemic, our healthcare system can easily be overrun. And after a Cascadia or a large earthquake, we want to make sure that you aren't injured, because it's going to be a while before we're able to get help to you.
Okay, we have about 4 more questions here, and one of them I'm going to go out of order because I do want to make sure that we talk on this. Can you talk about 2 weeks ready?
Sure. So 2 weeks ready is sort of a philosophy that we've been preaching for a little while. We all grew up with the 72-hour kit, and that's a great place to start. I mean, having a 72-hour kit is better than having nothing. But as we've learned more about Cascadia and as we see more frequent wildland fires, we know that it is just not enough if you have to shelter in place. think about last March when people were trying to get toilet paper and all of the stores were running out. People who had already prepared and had toilet paper were able to weather that fairly easily. Being 2 weeks ready means, kind of looking at your situation and sitting down with your family or your household or your neighborhood and asking what your needs are. Do you have young children? Do you have pets? Do you have elders? Do you have medically fragile people? And what would it take to be 2 weeks ready? And so keeping a journal over a 2-week period can be really helpful with that, marking down everything you use, what kind of food, what kind of medication, how many diapers, how much formula, and all that. And then you can start to really plan your action over a period of time, because preparedness doesn't happen in a single day. It's absolutely okay to take your time with this and do it, over the course of a year, 2 years, or however long it takes you. But we just want people to know that you may be on your own for a while after a large event like this, and you want to make sure that your family is safe. So we really encourage people to take those steps to be self-sufficient for at least 2 weeks.
Ted asked, do you have an approximate estimate of the size in Richter scale magnitude of a Cascadia earthquake by the time the shaking reaches the Portland, Vancouver area, knowing that this will be broad?
Yeah, so you're asking kind of two questions. Is how big is that original earthquake going to be? And it can be anywhere from a 7.6 to a 9.0. And then you're also asking, how strong will the shaking be where I'm at? And that is measured by a scale called the modified Mercalli scale. And we are expecting strong to very strong shaking, even in the Portland area. And we're expecting that shaking to last for 2 to 4 minutes. And so we know that this is going to significantly impact pretty much everything west of the Cascades. East of the Cascades, you're going to have some localized damage where that modified Mercalli scale might be some light shaking, but the buildings are just not built to withstand even sustained light shaking. Because remember that subduction zone earthquakes aren't those short California style where it may be 10 seconds, 20 seconds. This shaking will last for 2 to 4 minutes, possibly longer, depending on the soil type where you're at. So the magnitude at the coast might be a 9.0, but your modified Mercalli scale of intensity of shaking is going to be different depending on where you are. And there's a great online web viewer called HazView, HAZVU. And that's an interactive online viewer of geologic hazards. And you can type in your address and find out all kinds of interesting and scary things. And I highly recommend that folks check that out.
Okay, we are running out of time, and so I'm going to take the last few questions that were entered, but at this point, I won't take any more questions that people post in the chat, but we will post a way to ask questions afterwards. John asks, with large tanks of fuel and chemicals along the river, are we looking at a potential cloud of toxic gas rolling through downtown Portland?
That's a really good question. And that's, again, where some of the uncertainty is. I do know that there are significant efforts underway to retrofit and replace those hazardous areas in the critical energy hub and along the ports. There's one scenario where the fuel tanks do rupture and a fire starts that could possibly cause toxic fumes. But again, that's an unknown, but something that we also have to prepare for. If you are within the wind impacted area from that area, it would be also good to learn how to completely seal your house, even a little bit after an earthquake, in case something happens.
Okay, I've got 3 more questions, Althea. Are you okay with going like 1 or 2 minutes over?
Oh, absolutely. I'm here for as much time as you need.
Okay, if you're outside, like walking in Forest Park, how do you protect yourself?
So again, you want to get down as soon as possible. If you are close to an open field, and I mean 10, 15 feet, you might try going out there. Um, Unless it's been really, really wet, you probably don't need to worry about um, trees falling over, but also be aware of where you are in relation to somewhere that could be a landslide. There's a lot of slope in Forest Park, so that, after the shaking stops, you want to get to open ground that's not going to be impacted by a landslide as soon as possible.
Leanna on Facebook asks, is there an online resource that has the collapse potential of a historical building used for commercial purposes? Salem's Reed Opera House comes to mind.
So the answer is it depends on the community. I don't believe that Salem has that kind of resource available. I think Portland has done some of the only work that provides that kind of information. But it is certainly something that we encourage local communities to do. And this is where you, as citizen advocates, can reach out to your community leaders and request that kind of resource be created.
Randy on Facebook asked, can you talk a little bit about the ODOT lifelines as it relates to coastal communities?
Sure. So what the ODOT lifelines are is sort of a strategic hardening of some of the routes around the state, so that we are able to concentrate our very limited resources on routes that will serve the most good after the bad day happens. And so Highway 95 is one of the corridors as an alternate to I-5. There are a couple of routes, and I apologize, I don't have which ones right off the hand, but I believe there are 2 or 3 routes in north, central, and south coast that are being hardened. But that will be to a single point out on a coast. And from there, it might be a little bit more difficult to get north-south. 101 will pretty much cease to exist after Cascadia. But the longer it takes for it to actually happen, the more work ODOT will be able to do and harden more routes as we get closer to that date.
Okay, and last question, just kind of touching on what you just said with Highway 101 will be gone. Gary asked if an 8 to 9 quake and or killer tsunami leaves few survivors and damages that shuts down the state west of I-5, what are people supposed to do? Are they just supposed to wait for help to get to them?
So this is where you can reach out to your local community leaders and find out what kind of actions are being taken. The coastal communities are being very, very proactive on preparing for Cascadia. But this is also why we tell people it takes time to get emergency resources to communities that need them. It could, and that's why we highly encourage families to be at least 2 weeks ready. But if you are on the coast and you are not near a population center, being prepared for months, possibly 6 months before, resources of any kind can get out to you in any sort of quantity. So it's really important to understand that we will be doing our best to get resources out there, but it's simply going to take time. So it's, the individual's responsibility to, if they can, prepare to be self-sufficient so that they have food and water and medicine for themselves and their family and for their neighbors if necessary. Until we can actually get out there. We will be trying to get out there as soon as possible, but it will take us time.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I specifically want to thank Althea for all of her time and resource and wealth of knowledge. If you did not get your question answered, or if you have more questions or want more information, feel free to email us at public.info@state.or.us. We dropped that in the chat, and we just want to thank you all, and please stay safe.
Thank you.